participants coming in, and I'll welcome the participants coming in. We're so happy to see you here. We're going to get started in just a minute. Give everybody a chance to log into our webinar. Thank you for coming. Maybe we'll just wait one more minute to make sure everybody who wants to join is able to join. Wonderful. We're so happy to see all of you this morning. And best wishes for an wonderful International Women's Day here on March 8th. Monday, March 8th, and we are kind of starting out the Women's History Month. So we're really thrilled to see all of you joining us this morning. And I'm just going to get started with introductions. Welcome again to everybody who is joining us on International Women's Day as we start out with Women's History Month also. It is a big month for women and girls globally. My name is Cheryl Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of Global Rights for Women. We are based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are being hosted at this webinar by the Iowa Advocates. Yay for Global Rights for Women. And I just want to shout out a special thanks to the Iowa Advocates, just a wonderful group of human rights leaders who are supporting Global Rights for Women in their neighboring state, and then of course around the world. I'll tell you just a few logistical topics here. We have turned off your videos because that would be just kind of too chaotic on the screen. But we would love it, as we are talking here today, if you would put your questions in the chat. So my colleague, Pat Cumby, is going to monitor that chat box, and we will be selecting questions, trying to group together the ones with the common themes. And we will start that question and answer session at about 12:40. So like I say, welcome to everybody. We're thrilled you're joining us. My name is Cheryl Thomas. I'm the Executive Director of Global Rights for Women. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will monitor those and start at 12:40. And please also know that the webinar is being recorded, so you will have it available for your own. You can look it up after the conversation is done and send it to folks you think might be interested. So I'm going to just say a little bit about myself, and then also say a few words about Global Rights for Women, our organization, whose mission is to work with partners around the world and locally, obviously in Iowa, also here in Minnesota, and in dozens of countries around the world, with partners at their invitation to achieve systemic and legal reform on violence against women and girls. Violence against women and girls, as the United Nations has said, and many other global leaders, is one of the greatest human rights violations of our time. We believe that it is that violence that so powerfully undermines women's health, the health of their family, the health of their communities. And that's why we prioritize it so deeply and have just really a laser focus on it at Global Rights for Women. So it's my just great pleasure to welcome our two guests today, who are passionate women's human rights advocates and leaders. Rekha Basu, thank you so much for joining us. She has worked as a reporter, editorial writer, and columnist at newspapers in New York, Florida, and Iowa, and now is in Des Moines, of course. She's made numerous guest appearances on network television with Tom Brokaw, Rachel Maddow, Aaron Burnett, Gwen Ifill, and others. She's been featured on C-SPAN as the author of Finding Her Voice, a compilation of her Register columns. So we're so honored to have you, Rekha. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be here.
And our other panelist is Richard Ihrig. And Richard is the former chair of the board of directors of Global Rights for Women. So we have worked very closely together over the years in our work for women's human rights. Richard practiced law at Lindquist and Benham, now called Ballard Spahr, here in Minneapolis, was a partner for over 30 years. He also represented underserved populations at Minnesota Regional Legal Services. He's been a professor of law at William Mitchell Law School. And Richard is just a wonderful example of what power, how men can use their voice and their place to promote women's human rights. So huge thanks to you, Richard, for your commitment to this issue and for being with us here today on International Women's Day.
You're very welcome, Cheryl. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. So let's start out with a question to both of you. You have both really, in a unique way, used your voices, your talents, your leadership, and just your roles in your communities to promote women's human rights. And I would love, and I know our participants would love to learn a little more about yourself and how you came to the commitment to this issue, and in particular, to ending violence against women and girls locally and globally. Maybe we will start with you, Rekha.
Sure, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, wonderful. I have to say, I think I was born into it. And that's because I was born in India and raised in Libya, Egypt, Thailand, various other countries, India, before I was 10 years old, and then settled in New York from about the age of 10 on. And that's because my parents were both employees, professional secretariat staff of the United Nations from India in New York. And they both had different paths to getting here. My mother grew up in New Delhi in a fairly, I guess, upper middle class Indian household. And the normal trajectory would have been for her to have had an arranged marriage to someone of her same class, religion, linguistic group, all of that. She was not interested in any of that. She was very much of a scholar and very much human rights minded. So she decided, after getting her LLB in India in law school and teaching for a while, that she wanted to come to the United States and attend Yale Law School. And this was back in the 1940s, when there were a few women attending Yale Law School, but she managed to win a full fellowship there, leaving India, leaving her parents' ideas about getting her married off, and came here. She was, I think, one of only 2 women in her graduating class. And she went on to join the United Nations, and she joined the Human Rights Division of the UN. And then some years later, the Women's Rights Division split off from Human Rights. So it became the Division for the Equality of Men and Women. And that's where she made her long-term professional career. Excellent. So as a child, we were, my sister and I, just 2 of us, 2 girls, and she met and married my father, who was also working at the United Nations in economic assistance and technical assistance to Asia and the Far East. He's an economist, she's a lawyer. So you can imagine at the dining table every night, the conversations were very much about poverty, about oppression, about human rights violations, about women's rights. My mother authored the plan of action for the first International Women's Year, and the first conference was held in Mexico City. So we were at that conference, and all of the other planning conferences around the world in different regions, my sister and I were along for. So we learned a lot from attending those, and also from going out into different communities around the world and understanding what the issues were affecting women. A lot of domestic violence, a lot of patriarchy in various forms, a lot of forced marriages. In India, the country of my birth, there was this horrible practice known as dowry deaths, where when a man and a woman are betrothed to be married, there are certain demands made on the woman's family of payment to the man's family. And as time goes on, the demands keep escalating even after the marriage. And sometimes if the family of the bride cannot afford to meet all of those financial demands, then the husband and his family conspired to actually burn brides. And that led to the making of a film called Brides Are Not for Burning. And it's been a huge, huge problem. I think it's abated somewhat now, thanks to laws and cultural changes, but it still goes on in more rural areas. So that was one of the things that we saw. Honestly, my older sister became an academic. She got her doctorate in political science and women's and gender studies and went on to teach. She teaches currently at Amherst College in Massachusetts and has written a number of books about women. I was going in a different direction because I always was. So I wanted to be a theater arts major, and because I love to act, and I thought I was going to act professionally. But no sooner, I majored in sociology in college, and I just switched majors early on because I realized the issues I really cared about could not be confined to the world of a theater arts major. And so then I started writing for kind of left-wing progressive journals in the Massachusetts area. My first master's degree was in political economy and popular writing, it was called. And there was a magazine called Dollars and Cents. I don't know if any of you remember it, but it was a political economy journal, right? And so that was, my professor was a staff writer. And so some of my early offerings were printed in that publication. And then I realized I was writing mostly for the alternative press, and I really wanted some of my writings to be more nationally read by mainstream readers. So I went back to school, got a master's in journalism at Columbia University, and then started out working at small upstate New York newspapers and working my way up, eventually coming to Des Moines, to the Des Moines Register as an editorial writer from Schenectady, New York, where I had been doing the same thing. And most of my editorials were about global human rights issues, political issues, and gender issues. So I could talk much more about that. Some of my early offerings were about exploitations of women in a colonial context. So for example, at the time that I was writing this, when I was starting out in my journalism career, Britain was giving virginity tests. Do you remember this? Does anyone remember this? To women who were immigrating to England to marry Indian men who were settled in England. But Britain took it upon itself to start giving them internal exams at the airport when these women would arrive to make sure that they were still virgins, on the assumption that if they were not virgins, they could not possibly be betrothed to these men and they couldn't possibly be coming to get married. So then they would kick them out and send them back. And as we all know, a virginity test is not very foolproof, right? There are many ways in which a hymen can be broken that don't involve having sex. So I found this a particularly outrageous practice. And I think that was my first regular column offering. And then after that, there was this fellow by the name of Howard Samuel Sloan in New York. He was a New York stockbroker. He went off to Pakistan and quote unquote bought himself a wife in a very small village where even Urdu was not the language. There was a regional language, and it was a very poor village, but she was a very beautiful woman. And so the family happily accepted the money, brought her back to New York, kept her locked up in an apartment where she had no access to go out, couldn't speak, got her pregnant. And then when she was 9 months pregnant, threw her out with not even the slippers on her feet. Turned out he had another wife that was in New York, and he was just keeping this wife locked up in an apartment. And she found her way to a welfare line in New York where an African-American Muslim woman took her under her wing, took her into her home and cared for her through her childbirth. I got an interview with this Howard Samuel Sloan and said, what on earth possessed you to go when you already had a wife and you're going off to Pakistan to marry someone and paying money for her, and then you mistreat her and you beat her and you abuse her and throw you out? What on earth made you do that? And his answer, and then I'll stop after this, was pretty extraordinary. He said, we have a problem here in America, which is that women are just getting too independent. And now there's this whole women's rights movement, and women want to stand up for their rights, and anything they want, they can have. And, in Pakistan, he said, you could just beat your wife, you can abuse her, you can lock her, you can do anything to her, and she's not going to fight back at you. And quote unquote, I thought this was a wonderful solution to the problem. I'm going to stop it there. We'll talk more about these issues later.
Okay.
That's what spurred me on.
Oh, what a powerful personal story, Rekha. So the multi-dimensional answers to my question about your own just view of society and what you're seeing around you, and then these personal kind of interviews. And I have to say, I'm not sure I know too many women who went to the United Nations conferences on women's human rights. Did you go to Beijing in 1995?
I did not go to Beijing. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Beijing. My sister went though. She was there. My mother was very much there. So she was in the band.
Yeah, wonderful.
Were you there?
Yes, I was there. And
cool.
there was, I love to tell this story quickly, and then we're going to go on to Richard's answer to our question. But it was there, some of you may remember, that Hillary Clinton stood up in front of a crowd that I stood in, tens of thousands of other women from around the world in the pouring rain. And she said, women's rights are human rights.
Exactly.
And violence against women is a human rights violation. And the crowd erupted into cheers. That was 1995. And that was the first time a person of such prominence had said those words. So, and I feel like that really launched the international kind of collaborative women's movement, particularly in violence against women. So wonderful to hear that, especially on International Women's Day.
I'm so glad you were there.
I'll never forget it. Richard, please tell us, you use your platform also. You use your voice, you use your platform, and to promote women's human rights and end violence against women. And we'd love to know what it is that brought you to this powerful commitment that you use so often in your life.
Thanks, Cheryl. I've been a lawyer for almost 50 years. Of course, before that, I had to be a child. I think that in the home that I was raised in, there was some subtle nudges in the direction of social justice. Probably you'd call it distributive justice, about how unfairly the world's resources are allocated. In that, and of course that matured during my college years, which was the time of the Vietnam War. Then I went to law school, and I think things really were sharpened during law school. And social justice, I begin to think about in terms of human rights. And somewhere, I don't know, in the past 15 or 20 years, I've begun to really question the consequences of the patriarchy and the values of the patriarchy, the violence, the domination, the exploitation, the lack of stewardship of resources. And that led me to think more about the disparity between men and women all over the world, and what we simply have to acknowledge as male privilege. And then really through you, Cheryl, begin to understand better the way that power is attained and preserved through violence. All kinds of forms of violence. And thereby hangs a tale.
Okay. Thank you for that. It's such a important connection that you make between, and you said it too, actually, Rekha, the multiple forms of oppression and poverty. And I think it's particularly resonating with people today, and people are understanding that really dangerous, even deadly intersection between race and gender. And that, I hope, is something that we women's human rights leaders and feminists, certainly white feminists, can give voice to better than we have in the past. So thank you both for noting that
And
intersectionality of oppression.
Speaking of that
Yes.
intersectionality, I think another thing that's been very influential is the climate crisis.
Mhm.
And it, in a way, that seems to me to be the crowning achievement of the patriarchy. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for bringing us to the verge of extinction. You've done a great job.
And that too, that climate crisis also has a disproportionate effect on women. We find that, crises of these kind of cross-border nature really more affect the vulnerable, and women, and certainly girls, are certainly in that category. So I'm going to ask you both to shift just a little now to Global Rights for Women's mission is to promote legal and systemic reform, which just encompasses naturally social change, to end violence against women. But let's talk for just a minute. We'll go back to you, Rekha. Why are strong laws and policies that are the focus of Global Rights for Women's work so important in ending violence against women and girls?
Thank you for that question, Cheryl. And before I answer that directly, I'd just like to go to a quote that Gloria Steinem had. And Gloria Steinem had a long history in India, by the way, and I met her there in 2014 when she was giving a talk to Indian women activists about how the US and India had, women in each country had influenced each other as far as feminist practices go. So it was very moving. And what she said was the single determinant of whether a country is violent towards itself or others is whether it is violent towards its women and girls. And I think that is such an important thing to remember, that if it's violent towards its women and girls, it's more likely to be a warmonger country, and it's more likely to treat others with the same disrespect that it's treating its women and girls. So that's something that we have to remember when we're talking about women's rights. Now, as far as laws go, it's absolutely critical to establish from the top what is acceptable and not acceptable in a given society, what kind of behavior from the highest echelons of government. And it's critically important to also then enforce those laws. And I think those are two different things. I mean, while, we can pass really progressive laws, often we don't see them enforced, in part because of ongoing cultural patriarchy. In some cases, I'm sorry to say to those of you who have a religious preference, it's sometimes because of religion, because religion gets in the way of it. And in other cases, we see laws that are being enforced, and yet there are particular people, from county attorneys to lawyers to husbands to all kinds of people involved in DHS systems, who don't honor them when it comes to the mistreatment of women and girls. But laws are absolutely a government's way of articulating what is right and wrong behavior and establishing penalties and punishments so that it doesn't happen again. And I would say that America has helped lead the world in establishing laws against domestic violence and sexual assault, and also in opening up the conversation. And this is one of the things that Gloria Steinem talked about with the women in India. In opening up conversations, American feminism has really helped women talk about the personal. The whole slogan, "the personal is political," is something that took a long time to germinate in India, because there's a lot of shame and a lot of privacy associated with intermarital affairs, and also just talking about private personal affairs like sexuality, and certainly being the subject of abuse by your husband. And then, of course, in many countries, beating your wife is not illegal. Raping your wife is not even illegal, because there's this notion that once a man marries a woman, she's his property to do whatever he wants with. So I think that America's role was really important in establishing these parameters, but we still have to reinforce and educate so much in the world around what is right and what is wrong. A country like Ethiopia child marriage has been going on for decades, even though 2 decades ago it was halted by law. So it was made illegal to marry a girl off before the age of 18. 18 is the age of marriage and age of independence in Ethiopia, as I think it is here in some contexts. And yet Ethiopia is one of the leading countries in the world for child marriage. There are something like 2 million child brides in Ethiopia currently, people who are married off as early as age 10. And there are practices that, there are sort of social mores in Ethiopia that dictate that when you're 10 and you get married off to your husband, then you're supposed to live with his family as a child until 13. So he's not allowed to have sex with you until the age of 13, as if that's adulthood, right? But there are many husbands who don't observe that prohibition and will continue to do it anyway. And very sadly, there are a lot of religious leaders who insist that it's okay, that if it's cultural, then it can be defensible, and that it's up to individual families to perpetuate the culture. So there's this back and forth, and we can talk more about this later, but I'll give Richard a chance to answer that question. But yeah, laws are incredibly important, but enforcement is also incredibly important. So is culture.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rekha. They're the bedrock from, I think, so much else can grow.
Exactly.
Richard, would you speak to that also, the importance of Global Rights for Women's mission in making sure there are strong laws and policies? And then, like Rekha said, we are just very focused right now because so many new laws have passed around the world prohibiting domestic violence, sexual assault, human sex trafficking. We're being asked to help our colleagues in other countries enforce those laws with trainings. And so, Richard, would you speak to that?
Sure. Let me start by distilling some of what Rekha just said, and that is, a right is meaningless unless it can be enforced. And the way this planet is organized is that enforcement of laws comes through the state. So you simply have to have laws. A group of people, be it a nation or a smaller group, can have values, but unless those values are crystallized in the law, and in turn those laws are enforced, I think they're meaningless.
Right.
One of the questions that has often been put to me about global rights for women is why the emphasis on law reform in other countries?
Yes, yes.
And my response to that is, it's because that is where we are needed. The United States is, relative to the rest of the world, is fairly progressive and has, generally speaking, adequate laws on the books. That's not true in the rest of the world. And I think the time is long past when we should be looking only to our own nation. Indeed, I think this intense nationalism is part of the patriarchy's legacy. And at least the way I think about it, women in other countries are certainly as entitled to protection as women in the United States. So if that's where the need is, that's where global rights for women needs to be. And yes, we do work in Minnesota and Iowa and other things that ramify throughout the United States, but our focus is on law reform elsewhere. And I believe we are the only non-governmental organization that has that intense focus. And there are other organizations, and they are extremely valuable and deserving of our support, that focus on this issue domestically. So, our portfolio is generally offshore.
Right. And thank you for that, Richard. Yes, we are, Global Rights for Women is really laser focused on this legal reform and systemic reform on violence against women, because we see, and one of the reasons is, I just will say quickly here, in my 30 years of experience, I have seen what Rekha describes and you've described as just this, this devastating pandemic of violence against women and girls that is tolerated, whether it's statutory rape that happens in a child marriage. There was a report in the New York Times, I think today, about the increase of child marriage around the world. And that has been so underaddressed. And this is what I've known in my 30 years of working in this area. And that's what we have a couple of questions here we'll get to later, but that's how we end up working, is people from other countries ask Global Rights for Women to help them with drafting strong laws and building the capacity of police and prosecutors and advocates to train on the importance of enforcing those laws in a way that really protects women and holds violent offenders accountable. Because that's not only a punishment, that's also a message to the entire community about what you talked about, Rekha, that this will no longer be tolerated. And there aren't very many ways we can do that other than laws.
Exactly.
So thank you both for those insightful comments. And Rekha, may I ask you, are there particular issues? I feel like the global and the local, it just cannot be separated so much anymore. I mean, if the COVID pandemic hasn't taught us that, we're connected in so many ways across borders.
Yep.
We have significant populations of immigrant communities here in the US from both West Africa, East Africa, and Minnesota, from Southeast Asia. Tell us about, are there particular issues, are Iowa participants, particular issues related to violence against women in Iowa today or recently that you'd like to highlight for our Iowa participants?
Very much. Thank you for that question, Cheryl. So there are particular issues facing immigrant women and refugee women. And if we want to talk about them for a minute, then I'll get back to Iowa women in general, the general Iowa population. But yes, for immigrant women, now for undocumented immigrant women, there are particular threats on their safety because they are so much at risk of being turned in to immigration authorities that if they work in a meatpacking plant, and there have been stories like this, working at chicken processing plants, a lot of the female employees were being raped regularly by the manager, but they thought that just went with the territory, and they were terrified of calling police because they were told every time they threatened to do so that they would be turned over to INS, or now it's Homeland Security, and would be sent back to their home countries. So, there's a certain kind of abuse that women just inherently are forced to take in order to simply stay here, right? Then there are women who have come here who are of an older generation, for whom marital rape was just something that happened. I mean, some hideous, hideous stories. And I was actually part of a documentary film that Monsoon, United Asian Women of Iowa, which is a domestic violence sexual assault prevention group in Iowa that I helped to form, actually. They made it and I narrated it, and it's called Unburdening Our Mothers' Backs. And it talks about some of the practices that older women were used to with regard to rape within a marriage, and just violence, sheer violence towards women culturally on a day-to-day basis. And so part of the work that Monsoon is doing is trying to turn things around generationally. So they work a lot with young people, young Asian populations in school, and they give them cameras to take home to document what's called a photo voice project, what attitudes are like at home about relations between men and women, about marriage, about proper protocols for marriage, how one should treat each other, about laws, things like that. So they really started at the grassroots level. And instead of intimidate men and women so that husbands would prevent their wives from getting involved in organizations like this, they start out holding community potlucks and gatherings to
Yes.
celebrate various, New Year's in different Asian countries, so that people start trusting them and they come forward and they talk to them. And once they've incurred their trust, then they'll sit down and talk about practices and what the laws are, educate them on the fact that, rape and sexual assault are not allowed in marriage. Then there is the other issue of visa status. If a woman does not have her own visa and she's being abused by her partner or by anybody else, what happens to her if she reports it and if she wants to separate from him, if she doesn't have her own independent visa. Unfortunately, there are new visa categories now that have been
Yes.
established that women can stay in the country, especially if they're going to be testifying against someone in a sexual assault case and there is a criminal case. So the importance of bringing charges, right? And then potentially being able to stay on. But I will say,
That's our federal law, actually, the VAWA petition, they call it, Violence Against Women petition.
Exactly.
Yes, and it's a model for the world. So thank you for bringing that up, our federal law.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's exactly right. And it's really, and it's been, jeopardized in past years with not being reinstated.
Yes,
Yeah, that's one thing. And we could talk a lot about different political incursions on women's rights, and maybe we'll get to that later in the Q&A.
Right.
I just want to say a note about Iowa women in general, and I'm talking about mainstream Iowans who are not from immigrant backgrounds. So when I started putting together my book a few years ago, it's called Finding Her Voice, and it's about women's empowerment in Iowa, in the Midwest, through different experiences, personal experiences that have happened to them. I was amazed by how many of the columns that I had written, because it's a book of past columns, were about young women, adolescent women, and how many of them involved sexual abuse. And what was stunning to me was how in these small towns, everything from parents to doctors to coaches to, anyone that they were interacting with could potentially be an abuser to, in one case, a woman had broken up with her boyfriend, a young girl had broken up with her boyfriend in Mason City, Iowa, and the boys were just writing these hateful slurs and smears against her, calling her the nastiest names, tormenting her. So what did the school do about it? They said, well, we obviously can't protect you to stay in class, so we're just going to take you and educate you in the principal's office every day, instead of doing anything to the boys, right? And in case after case after case, this was the response, was if some girls had the courage to come forward and speak up about a coach who had been sexually abusing them for years, for generations, then the community would turn against them. They would become the pariahs because he had won so many games. His team had won so many games. And, so many small communities are all about their sports teams doing well and making heroes out of the people who are their coaches. There was another case in which a woman told me about how she had been sexually abused by her pediatrician. And this had gone on for generations too. And they tried to speak up about it and the nurses protected him. Finally, he was convicted, but that was decades later. So this stuff goes on in small towns and in communities. We need a lot more education and a lot more. And then there's this one case in which a woman was abused by her husband, who she was separated from, but he came to the door one day and he didn't have custodial rights. It was late at night, forced his way in, tried to strangle her, put her head under a pillow until she couldn't breathe. So she called the police. He was arrested for violating a no contact order, but she was arrested and charged even harder for facilitating the violation of a no contact order. Figure that one out, right? That was a worse offense than violating the actual no contact order and trying to smother your wife. So it turns out, and this is a long story, that the county attorney who brought these charges was himself a domestic abuser. And that came out many years later, right? And that was a follow-up column that I wrote. So some of these people who don't follow the law and don't enforce the law are themselves part of that culture that would abuse women.
Right. And this is so true throughout the world too. So many of our criminal justice professionals, police, in particular, police can be such heroes in this movement. They can also be massive abusers and protected by their whole community of police officers, which is so dangerous for women.
Exactly. I just want to read you one quote from a piece that I wrote about Ethiopian women that I think is true of women and girls everywhere as to why there is so much violence against women in a sexual sense. And what I wrote was, I came to understand that this intense fear of female sexuality, and by extension, female power and independence, has driven so many harmful traditions, from child marriage to female genital mutilation. I saw a link between those fears in Africa and the ones that are fueling a backlash against birth control back home, and driving rape, battery, and other anti-female violence. And I can see that happening with Iowa legislature's attempts to also end contraception and abortion rights.
Thank you. Boy, what a powerful way of bringing that together. Thank you, Rekha. Pat has joined us for the question and answer session. Thank you so much. My colleague, Pat Kumbi, is monitoring the chat for questions. Before we do that, Pat, I just want to, that Rekha's comment about institutions, you know, we think about the church, the military, college campuses, sports, all of workplaces, all of these institutions that are really still so very much dominated by men have been such bastions of the abuse of women.
Yes.
And Richard, so I will put you on the spot here, Richard. What can men do? What is it? Why is men's involvement in this, their leadership in ending women's human rights abuses and violence against women, so important?
Well, I'm tempted to say they should just get the hell out of the way. But that's where the power resides right now. And I tend to view things often as that you hold, any power that you have, you should hold as a fiduciary, to use a legal term. And it's not to be used for your own gratification, but rather to make this place a better world. As far as what men can do, I think the first thing is just to reflect and observe on a daily, hourly basis male privilege, in the same way that on the racial front, we need to be thinking about white privilege and observe it. And once you start to observe that, it has a kind of, I believe, solvent effect that it begins to break down some of these cultural beliefs that underlie violence against women. The other thing is teach your children well, teach your boys well, teach your girls well. I've had the privilege this week of living in the presence of my two granddaughters. So if you've seen me smile from time to time during this presentation,
I think we might have heard him in the background too.
It's not that I'm not smiling at what I'm hearing, but I'm just observing those kids being around. So, but I think the first is to serious reflection, and I think most importantly, not just observe others, but observe yourself. We men have a lot to learn, and part of it is to understand why we act the way we do toward women. And we'll leave it there for now. I'm sure there are other questions that need answering.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yes, that constant attention, I think, for all of those of us who come from any position of privilege, whether it's economic or race or gender, our attention to that, I think we are understanding, the importance of that in a way, hopefully now, and that will grow. So thank you for that, Richard. And I'm going to ask Pat to pose let us know some of the questions that we have from our participants.
Oh, they've been coming in fast and furious.
Oh,
So-
wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, there's lots of really specific questions and really broad questions. And before I jump into that, I just want to say I put into the chat a few things for your information. So you can always go to our website if you want to find out more. Donate if you want to participate in that way. We'd love for you to keep in touch, joining our email list. We're also hosting another great conversation on April 8th in our new series called Valiant Voices, and this is on the Survivors Memorial that's here in Minneapolis. We'll be talking to the artist and creator of that, so stay tuned. So there's one really great question that I think a lot of them are pointing to, and this one is, what can we do and how can I learn more about this subject? This is very interesting to me and I want to somehow learn, get involved. Thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to bring this to Zoom. So how would you
Oh, how nice.
to address that?
How lovely. Well, I'd love to hear the ideas of our panelists, and I have a few of my own. So, Rekha?
Well, I was going to say read my column, but that
No, that's a great one. Your columns are
actually my book. I mean, I think it's available at Des Moines Library, Iowa Libraries. Has a lot of these kinds of cases to start us off with, and then you know, there are organizations. There are organizations in Des Moines which are culturally specific to different groups. So there's one for Latinas. It's called LULAC. Is it? No, Luna. And there's one for African women, and there's this one for Asian women that I mentioned. There's one for Native women also. So some of those people, the people who had them would be wonderful resources, depending on who you want to know about. There's a wonderful program that the Iowa International Center does every year, and I have learned so much from the women that they bring over. So they have a program of bringing over State Department honorees from different countries who are called Women of Courage, right? I think there are a dozen of them every year, and Iowa is very lucky to get one every year, to host one every year. And I've just learned amazing things from them. One came from Afghanistan, one came from Fiji, one came from Syria, and they're people who are in the political vanguard, women who are activists for gender rights, and they talk about the rights of women and the roles of women in a very political context, and how, you know, liberation interfaces, and what you were saying earlier, Cheryl, it's both political and personal, and how, you know, in a lot of countries that we're talking about in the developing world, gender rights weren't separated from rights of minority populations, tribal populations, but women have always been very much in the vanguard of those struggles, you know?
Sure.
So there's what we call intersection. So, I mean, get involved in intersectionality is the other thing. Try to go to some of these events, which are open to the public, which are open to anyone. And if you'd like to get links and addresses from me, please reach out to me. I can be
How nice. Thank you.
Of course. This is to anyone there. rbasu@dmreg.com.
How nice. Thank you so much for that.
Put that in the chat. Yes, I'm
Thank
happy
you.
to.
And yeah, there's some information being shared in the chat.
Great.
So that's wonderful. Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, go to globalrightsforwomen.org.
There we go.
Yes, of course.
But there's also a book that Jimmy Carter wrote, really quite a courageous book.
Yeah.
He's written more than one courageous book.
He has.
Cheryl, you'll have to supply the name, but the theme of it is that the human rights issue of our time is women's rights in all of its manifestations, but particularly in this right to be free from violence.
That's a beautiful one. And of course, I'm not going to remember the name either, but he says it very clearly. The
Yes.
women's human rights, the right to be free from violence, are the greatest human rights issues of our time, as do many other leaders. It's interesting. Nicholas Kristof and his wife, Cheryl Woodun, wrote a book called Half the Sky, probably, I don't know, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, accessible. It's an accessible way of learning about what sounds it can sound kind of complicated, and how do we do this work? And he makes it very accessible that way. So that's another one. And as Richard said, go to our website, Global Rights for Women's website. Pat mentioned that we're starting a conversation series called Valiant Voices. We have which will feature leaders in the movement, survivors' voices. We are very committed to making sure all of our trainings, our initiatives with our partners start by listening to women, listening to survivors about what their lived experience has been and what they need. And when people want to know how we can be successful in achieving change in other countries, that's how we do it. We don't come in with an agenda. We listen to survivors in the place where the change is needed. Yes, and we have one other thing I was going to say. So sign up for our newsletter too. That's quarterly. Pat?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. And that is, how can enforcement of laws take place effectively?
Like I said, actually, that's a fabulous way to follow up on what I just said. The enforcement of laws is essential, obviously. There has been over the last 20 years a firestorm of activity in creating strong laws around the world. We have so many more laws on domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking on the books than we did when I started this work in 1993. It's just really magnificent. But I would say, unfortunately, most of those laws are not effectively enforced. And it comes back to not only do the laws have to be written well, first challenge, they have to be passed, get them on the books. Then the legal professionals who are tasked with the enforcement of those laws have to be in a place where they have the skills to understand what their interventions are going, what the results of their intervention is going to do. They have to have the really simple technical capacity to write an effective police report, a detailed police report, not respond by shaming and blaming women, as Rekha so eloquently described. So our trainings, when we do them at the request of our international partners, and that is most of what we do now, is on the effective enforcement of laws, is we talk about how critical it is that the agencies, a multi-agency coordinated community response be in place, and that survivors and their advocates who are closest to the issue lead the discussion about how we are doing in the community with enforcement of laws. Otherwise, women won't use them. So, and again, another question we could spend lots and lots of time on. Anything you want to add to that, Richard or Rekha?
Add, there are two other, I think, components that are pretty important in holding law enforcement accountable or others accountable. One is the press, in calling out when laws are not being enforced, when they're being violated. And this goes for in this country and every country, right? If you have a free press is very, very essential to that. And by using specific examples, like some of the ones that I've offered, I think, you can open people's awareness and consciousness. The other that's really important is, I think, grassroots movements. Yes. You need people out on the street marching. You need women and you need male allies, and this is something Richard has talked about very eloquently as well. You need, after there was a particularly heinous case of a rape in India back in 2012. And it was just disgusting. And there had been many others like that. But what really started to turn things around were there were these mass mobilization attempts of men and women just closing off the streets of New Delhi and marching all over the country against this. And laws were changed. So really, mass mobilization is a critical component of holding officials' feet to the fire.
Standing up, exactly, and being proactive about using your voice, and we've seen that in the Black Lives Matter movement also.
Yes. And I just want to, I know we are running out of time, but I just want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine who is on trial today. She's a writer for the Moines Register, and Her name is Andrea Sahuri. She's Palestinian actually, and she was covering a BLM protest in Des Moines back over the summer, and the police arrested her and threw her in prison because she didn't move fast enough. So they charged her with failure to disperse and interference with official acts, and without any evidence to my knowledge. There is a trial currently going on today in Des Moines that's going to determine whether they find her guilty of some offense or not. We don't believe there were any offenses involved. We believe she was just doing her job as a journalist and trying to point out that the wrong people are getting arrested here. So, I think International Women's Day is a really good time to keep her in our thoughts and for justice to prevail in her case.
Wonderful. Oh, I so appreciate your mentioning her, because that is something that our Iowa participants can really focus on and read about and make sure their voices are being heard about that.
Thank you.
So I think one last question, and I think Cheryl, if you want to take this one, and then also Cheryl has an announcement on behalf of the Iowa advocates, and then we'll be ready to conclude. But this is another really great question. Laws, enforcements, great. How do you change the cultural aspect?
Yes. There is no separating any of these issues. This is my belief, and I would actually love to have your input too, Richard and Rekha, but laws reflect culture. So if you don't have, we have many colleagues around the world who are working so hard to have, right now, I just happen to be involved in this right now, to have marital rape included in domestic violence laws. As Rekha mentioned, there's many countries in the world that don't criminalize marital rape. It's just not something that is prohibited. That's a reflection of the culture. Okay, so I make that tie there because I think you cannot separate. But I acknowledge the questioner's, inquiry in that just because you have a law, that doesn't change the culture. It's a multifaceted community rising up that we have to see in all of our institutions and our individuals. We can have a policy on campus or a policy in the military or a new law on sexual assault, unless not only the enforcers, but the family members of the victim, the family members of the perpetrator, the leaders in the school are all committed to women's fundamental human rights and their fundamental human right to be free from violence. That's what it takes. Then we have the culture change we need to support those laws. Richard or Rekha, do you have other thoughts about that? We have about
I would observe that there is a conversation, if you will, between law and culture.
Yes.
Culture influences laws, laws influence culture.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If you want to think about the importance of law, think about where racial justice would be without such law reform as Brown versus Board of Education, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act.
Beautiful.
And I would just add one other thing. We are at a pivotal point, I think, culturally, politically, historically, where the gains that have been made can be lost. There are a lot of regressive and autocratic forces at loose. And now is not the time to relax or further.
Thank you, Richard. Fabulous last comment. Rekha, do you have one last thing you'd like to say?
I can't do better than Richard just did. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think it's on all of us and everyone who belongs to a cultural organization, whether it's a church, whether it's a religious establishment or whether it's a club of a male book club or whatever, to speak your voices, use your leverage as a member of whatever that cultural group is to speak out.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that. Use your, I love that. That institutional thing we were talking about. You're part of those, all of you. So, that's just wonderful, Rekha. Thank you so much for that. And like Pat said, I just, again, Well, first of all, I want to thank this has just been such a fun discussion, and thank you, Rekha and Richard, for joining us. I think you're both in sunny places, so it's really special that you took time out to join us for this panel on International Women's Day. And I want to thank the Iowa Advocates for hosting this. They have been an amazing group of human rights activists and women's human rights activists that have been a great gift to global rights for women. And they are planning, I should say, are planning a fundraiser in Des Moines at the Savory Hotel on November 4th. So please mark your calendars. We'll be sending more and more details out about that as time goes on. And I just really encourage you all to take a look at what we are announcing in as I said before, in our newsletter for things that you can do. There's just something you can do all the time to push this issue forward, and be in touch with your local organizations that are serving women on the front lines. They are sheroes in every way, particularly during these times of COVID isolation. So Pat, have I forgotten anything there? Okay, I think we are good. Again, I wish you all a wonderful Women's History Month and a wonderful International Women's Day, and we will all go forth towards a fairer, more just, safer world for women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you.